Are you ready to know how this story took an unexpected turn years later? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. At 22, Lucas felt the weight of failure in every breath. He had already dropped out of college, a path that should have been promising, but had become unbearable. The once vibrant university corridors, which were once full of opportunities, now seemed nothing more than a distant memory of a life he could no longer reach. Everything he had dreamed for himself, a successful career, the respect of his parents, the admiration of friends, seemed to have crumbled like a house of cards. It was late at night when he decided he needed to get away from the suffocating reality that surrounded him. El Trovador, a cheap and lively bar he used to frequent, was the refuge that came to mind. He didn't know if he was going there to get lost in the crowd or to drown in a bottle of tequila, but something inside him desperately needed an escape, even if temporary. When he entered the bar, the flashing lights and deafening sound of music greeted him like old friends. But it wasn't just the environment that attracted him. He wanted more than just to hide from his problems. He wanted to impress Clara. Clara was everything Lucas wasn't: confident, charming, and above all, inaccessible. She seemed to float above people, always surrounded by friends who laughed at her jokes, admirers who waited for a chance to win her gaze. Lucas knew she was popular, knew she was out of his league, but in that moment of desperation, he believed he could do something that would change that perception. If he could be the fun guy, the center of attention, maybe she would finally notice him. He ordered his first drink of the night, trying to ignore the concerned look from Bruno, the bartender. "Another round of tequila," he said, with forced confidence that trembled on the edge of nervousness. Bruno hesitated, knowing well Lucas's weak resistance to alcohol. "Lucas, you've had enough. I don't want any trouble with you tonight." But Lucas was determined. He smiled, forcing a confidence he didn't feel, and gestured discreetly in Clara's direction. "Come on, Bruno, just one more. I'm trying to impress someone." Bruno sighed, giving in to Lucas's insistence. He knew he shouldn't, but he knew Lucas well enough to know that when Lucas was decided, there was no dissuading him. As the bartender served the drink, Lucas watched Clara and her group of friends. She was laughing at something one of the friends had said, completely oblivious to the internal chaos Lucas was facing. With the drink in hand, he approached Clara's group, trying to mask his insecurity. "Girls, how about we have some drinks?" He tried to sound casual, almost charming, but his voice faltered slightly. Clara, who was in the middle of an animated conversation, looked up and smiled superficially. "Sure, Lucas, but I hope you can stay on your feet this time." Her mocking laugh echoed in Lucas's mind, reminding him of the last time he had tried to impress her and ended up passing out drunk. Despite the shame consuming him, Lucas was determined to show that he could handle the situation. He served the drinks and started drinking with the girls, trying to keep up with their pace. However, as the night progressed, the alcohol began to take effect. The bar lights, which before created a euphoric atmosphere, now seemed to spin around him, and the music, which before animated him, became a distant buzz. Lucas felt he was losing control but didn't know how to stop. Isabel had always known that her son Lucas was going through a difficult time. Since he had dropped out of college, she had noticed a disturbing change in his behavior. The nights he used to spend at home studying were gradually replaced by frequent outings, almost always returning home smelling of alcohol. Isabel was a woman who had lived long enough to understand the signs of a lost soul, and she feared Lucas was sinking into a path of no return. That night, as Lucas headed to El Trovador, Isabel decided to follow him. It wasn't the first time she had done this, but always with the hope that maybe, just maybe, he was just seeking a moment of distraction and would return home without incident. She knew he would be furious if he knew he was being watched, but a mother's love often overcomes the fear of any consequence. And at that moment, Isabel's greatest fear was what could happen to Lucas if she wasn't there to protect him. Isabel entered the bar with hesitant steps, trying not to draw attention. El Trovador wasn't the kind of place a woman like her would frequent. A middle-aged woman, with gray hair and modest clothes. She wasn't there to have fun. She was there to fulfill the duty she felt as a mother, even if it meant putting herself in uncomfortable situations. She sat in a dark corner, where she could observe Lucas without being seen, and ordered a glass of orange juice, the only thing on the menu that seemed remotely appropriate for her. She saw Lucas at the bar talking to the bartender, Bruno. The way he leaned forward with a forced smile told Isabel everything she needed to know. Lucas was nervous, insecure, and had already drunk more than he should. When he grabbed the bottle of tequila and headed to the group of young people, and specifically to Clara, the young woman for whom he had an evident attraction, Isabel felt a pang of pain in her chest. It wasn't just worry consuming her, but also the sadness of seeing her son sinking into something she knew would only bring him more suffering. As Lucas tried to insert himself into the conversation, Isabel watched his every move carefully. She saw when he served the drinks, when he tried to keep up with the others, and when the drink began to show its effects. Lucas's smile became more trembling, his words slower and his steps more faltering. Isabel knew the worst was yet to come, and she was right. Lucas, in an attempt to join the group on the dance floor, stumbled, unable to maintain balance due to the alcohol. He tried several times but ended up falling heavily onto a nearby sofa, provoking laughter and mockery from Clara and her friends. Isabel felt his humiliation as if it were her own. She wanted to run to him, hold him, tell him everything would be okay. But she knew that any public intervention at that moment would only make things worse. As the night progressed, Isabel began to think about how she could intervene without embarrassing Lucas in front of his friends, but time was against her. She saw the moment when Lucas, clearly humiliated, returned to the bar and ordered another round for everyone. Bruno, this time, refused to serve him, knowing that Lucas was already beyond the limit. But Lucas, frustrated and embarrassed, looked around, desperately searching for a way out of his humiliation. That's when he saw Isabel, sitting in the corner, watching him. The look Lucas gave his mother was one of pure anger mixed with despair. In his mind, everything seemed wrong. The woman who should be his protector now became his silent accuser. He staggered towards her, his face contorted in a mixture of shame and fury. "What the hell are you doing here?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the bar. "Are you spying on me?" Isabel felt each word like a blow. She tried to calm him down, explain that she was there only because she cared about him, because she feared for his safety. But Lucas, overcome by alcohol and frustration, was not willing to listen. "I don't need you to take care of me," he shouted again, drawing the attention of everyone in the bar. "Leave me alone." With a broken heart, Isabel remained silent. She knew she couldn't reach him in that state, knew that every word of hers would only push him further away. But even as he staggered away, her heart couldn't stop worrying. She was there for him, and would continue to be there, even if he didn't realize it. Lucas could barely keep his eyes open as he walked back towards the bar. The humiliation he had just suffered in front of Clara and her friends reverberated in his mind, mixed with anger and shame for having his mother there, witnessing everything. He felt he was losing control, not just of his movements, but of his entire life. In a last effort to assert himself, he approached Bruno, demanding another round of drinks, but the bartender, firmly, refused to serve him. It was at this moment that Lucas spotted his mother, Isabel, sitting in the dark corner of the bar, her eyes full of a mixture of sadness and concern. Something inside him broke. Her presence there, in that place where he was trying to get away from his failures, seemed like the final blow in a night that was already completely ruined. Staggering, he went towards her, shouting and accusing her of spying on him. Isabel tried to speak, to explain that she was there because she cared about him, but Lucas wouldn't listen. Instead, he walked away, determined to leave that place, any way he could. He then remembered his car. It was a way out, a way to escape from that unbearable situation. His mind, obscured by alcohol and wounded pride, convinced itself that driving would get him out of there, that at the wheel he could regain some of his lost dignity. With uncertain steps, Lucas returned to the bar and asked Bruno for the car keys. Bruno, alarmed, refused, saying he was in too dangerous a state to drive, but Lucas ignored his friend's advice. He searched his own pockets with trembling hands until he found the keys. Determined, he staggered towards the exit. Isabel, watching from her corner, knew she couldn't let this happen. She quickly got up and followed Lucas, trying to stop him before he did something irreversible. "Lucas, please, listen to Bruno. You can't drive like this," she pleaded, her voice laden with desperation. But Lucas, consumed by the need to get away from everything and everyone, especially his mother, gently pushed her aside. "Leave me alone," he shouted, almost breathless, before unlocking the driver's door and throwing himself into the seat. Isabel didn't know what to do. She couldn't just let him go, couldn't risk losing him to something as trivial and devastating as an accident caused by his own recklessness. In an act of desperation, she got into the car and sat in the passenger seat, hoping that, with her presence, she could somehow prevent the disaster she felt approaching. Lucas started the car with a roar of the engine, and without thinking twice, sped out of the parking lot. The streets were almost deserted at that hour of the night, illuminated only by streetlights and the facades of closed shops. Lucas was driving fast, recklessly ignoring traffic signs and his mother's warnings, who, terrified, begged him to stop. "Lucas, please stop. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. We can go back to the bar and call a taxi," Isabel pleaded. But the words fell on deaf ears. The car was accelerating too much, and time seemed to slow down for Isabel. In the blink of an eye, she saw an elderly man crossing the street ahead of them. Lucas, too drunk to react in time, barely had a chance to notice the danger before hitting the man head-on. The impact was brutal, and the car stopped with a jolt, the metallic sound of the collision echoing through the silent street. Suddenly, the alcohol seemed to evaporate from Lucas's mind. He became sober from the shock, looking horrified at the man lying on the road, not moving. "What have I done?" he muttered, almost to himself, while Isabel, trembling, got out of the car and ran to the man, shouting for someone to call an ambulance. She knew time was running out, that a person's life was hanging by a thread because of a moment of irresponsibility. Lucas, still inside the car, was overcome by a wave of panic. His mind was racing, desperately seeking a way to escape the consequences that now seemed inevitable. He knew that if it was discovered that he was driving drunk, his life would change forever. And it was then that he made the most difficult and selfish decision of his life. "Mom," he called, his voice choked with fear. "Please say you were driving. I can't handle this." Isabel barely had time to process the request, but the desperation in his eyes and the trembling voice of her son convinced her. She nodded, the pain in her heart being suffocated by the need to protect him, as she had done all her life. When the police arrived, Lucas, still in panic, repeated the lie, and Isabel, with a heavy heart, took the blame. That night changed their lives forever. Isabel was immediately arrested, and Lucas, as he watched his mother being taken away, felt temporary relief mixed with overwhelming guilt. He knew she was sacrificing everything for him, and although he couldn't admit it at that moment, a part of him hated himself for what he had done. That night, as he returned alone to the bar, Lucas felt the weight of his actions beginning to sink him into an abyss from which he didn't know if he could escape. When the patrol car doors closed, Lucas felt the metallic sound resonate like an echo in his soul. The image of his mother being taken away, handcuffed, with eyes empty of hope, would be etched in his memory forever. He watched as the blue and red lights of the police car disappeared on the horizon, taking with them the only person who had always been by his side. The silence that followed was deafening, a void that consumed any trace of relief he might have felt. Lucas stood there on the cold sidewalk, not knowing what to do. The feeling of guilt began to accumulate inside him like a storm about to explode. With each passing second, he sank deeper into the reality of his actions. He had asked his mother, the woman who had sacrificed so much for him, to lie. And now she was going to prison for a crime she didn't commit. Lucas knew he should have taken responsibility, but fear consumed him in the moment of truth. And now he was trapped in a web of lies from which he didn't know how to escape. While Lucas struggled with his conscience, Isabel faced the harsh reality of prison. She was greeted by a heavy, almost suffocating atmosphere that seemed to feed on despair and hopelessness. The cell walls, dark and cold, were a constant reminder that her freedom had been taken from her. However, even in that gloomy environment, Isabel tried to find a way to stay strong. She knew her sacrifice was to protect Lucas, and this belief was the only thing that kept her standing. The first days in prison were the hardest. Isabel felt the isolation like a knife in her soul. Without her family, without Lucas, She felt completely alone. She thought about how her life had changed so drastically and quickly, how a single night of wrong decisions had led her to a place where she never imagined she would be. The pain of losing her freedom, combined with constant worry about Lucas's future, was almost unbearable. Isabel also had to learn to navigate the complex prison hierarchy, where every movement and word were carefully observed by guards and inmates. At first, she was greeted with distrust by other prisoners. She was different, a middle-aged mother with a gentle and quiet behavior, who seemed out of place in that brutal environment. But Isabel, with her calmness and resilience, soon gained the respect of many of the women around her. She began to connect with other inmates, listening to their stories and offering support whenever she could. She realized that, although they were there for different reasons, many of the women around her shared the same pain: the loss of their families, guilt for their mistakes, and the hopelessness of never recovering their lives. Isabel became a maternal figure for some of the younger inmates, offering advice and comfort in a place where compassion was a rare commodity. However, life in prison wasn't just made of moments of connection and solidarity. Isabel faced several episodes of violence and abuse, both from other inmates and sometimes from the prison staff itself. There were days when despair almost overwhelmed her, when it seemed there was no hope of getting out of that place. She clung to memories of Lucas and the letters he began to send regularly, like a lifeline in the midst of a sea of darkness. Lucas, on the other hand, tried to deal with guilt and despair in ways he couldn't fully understand himself. The nights that were once spent in bars were now consumed by obsessive thoughts about what he had done. He began to isolate himself, pushing away friends and anyone who tried to help him. The idea that his mother was in prison because of him was a burden he didn't know how to carry. When Sophia, Isabel's best friend, called him, Lucas could barely articulate a coherent response. She told him about the prison, about how Isabel was dealing with the situation, and how they were trying to find a way to free her. But Lucas could barely listen. Every word seemed like a blow. Every news about his mother in prison made his guilt increase even more. Sophia, realizing Lucas's state, decided she needed to act. She contacted Gabriel Martins, a defense lawyer known for his integrity and for fighting against legal injustices. Gabriel had worked as a prosecutor for years, but changed careers after witnessing many injustices in the system. When Sophia told him about Isabel's case, Gabriel didn't hesitate to offer his help. He knew it would be a difficult fight, but believed that the truth would eventually come out. While Sophia and Gabriel worked tirelessly to gather evidence that could exonerate Isabel, Lucas sank deeper and deeper into guilt and despair. He knew he should be helping, that he should be by his mother's side, but each attempt to get involved left him paralyzed by fear. He feared that any word of his could further complicate the situation. Silence became his form of punishment, a self-imposed punishment that isolated him from everyone around him. However, isolation only made the guilt grow. Each day that passed, Lucas became more aware of the weight of his mother's sacrifice. He knew he couldn't continue living that way, but the idea of facing the truth, of confessing his mistakes, terrified him. What he didn't know was that even in prison, Isabel wasn't just fighting for her own freedom. She was fighting for him, for his future, and for the unconditional love that only a mother could have. While Isabel faced the harsh reality of prison, Lucas waged an internal battle as devastating as his mother's. Each letter he received from Isabel was a silent reminder of the sacrifice she had made for him. She wrote with a serenity that contrasted with the chaos Lucas felt inside. With every word, every line, he saw how much she was willing to endure out of love for him, and this only made the guilt more unbearable. Sophia and Gabriel were determined to prove Isabel's innocence. They believed that, with the right evidence and proper testimonies, they could convince the court to review the case. But justice, they knew, wasn't always fair, and the fight they faced was long and full of obstacles. The first task was to get Lucas to collaborate. Gabriel knew that Lucas's testimony would be crucial, but the young man was paralyzed by guilt and fear. When Sophia first approached Lucas asking him to help in his mother's defense, his reaction was one of panic. "I've already done everything wrong," he said, his voice laden with despair. "If I say anything now, it will only make things worse." Sophia tried to convince him that it wasn't like that that he needed to face the truth to help his mother. But Lucas simply couldn't convince himself of that. For him, the idea of facing a court, of looking a judge in the eye and confessing his mistakes, was terrifying. Time passed, and Lucas continued to hide behind his own walls of fear and regret. He knew that each day that passed was one more day his mother spent in prison for something she hadn't done. But the idea of confronting the situation paralyzed him. Meanwhile, Sophia and Gabriel worked tirelessly, trying to find other ways to build a strong defense for Isabel. They collected testimonies from friends and acquaintances who could attest to Isabel's character, her clean life, and her unconditional love for Lucas. They revisited the accident site, searched for security cameras that might have captured some important detail, and interviewed all the witnesses they could find. But without Lucas's confession, everything seemed insufficient. It was as if they were fighting with their hands tied. Finally, Sophia decided she needed to be more direct with Lucas. On a rainy afternoon, she went to his house and knocked on the door with determination. Lucas opened the door, his face marked by lack of sleep and the weight of remorse. "Lucas," said Sophia, entering without waiting for an invitation. "We can't do this without you. Your mother is there in prison because you asked her to, and now she's counting on you to help her get out." Lucas felt Sophia's words like a knife, cutting through his denial. He knew she was right, but still, fear held him back. "What if I mess everything up?" he asked, almost whispering. "What if, in trying to fix this, I end up making everything even worse?" Sophia approached him, holding his hands firmly. "Lucas, you've already done the worst thing you could do. You asked your mother to lie for you. Now you have the chance to do the right thing. She doesn't deserve to be there, and you won't be able to live with this if you don't do something about it." Those words finally penetrated Lucas's defenses. He knew Sophia was right. He couldn't keep running away. If he didn't face what he had done, the weight of guilt would destroy him. And more than that, he knew that his mother, Isabel, was suffering because of him, and that the only way to redeem himself was by confessing the truth. With a trembling but determined voice, Lucas agreed to meet with Gabriel. They scheduled a meeting at the lawyer's office, and Lucas arrived there feeling as if he were walking to the gallows. Gabriel's office was large, with shelves of law books and a large wooden desk. The environment exuded seriousness, which only increased Lucas's anxiety. "Thank you for coming, Lucas," said Gabriel, in a tone that mixed concern and encouragement. "I know this isn't easy, but it's an important step." Lucas nodded, unable to find words. He was scared, but he had made the decision to finally speak the truth. During the conversation, Lucas told Gabriel everything that happened on that fateful night. He described how desperate he was to impress Clara, how alcohol overtook him, and how, in desperation after the accident, he begged his mother to take the blame. Gabriel listened in silence, taking notes, and when Lucas finished, the lawyer looked him directly in the eyes. "Lucas," Gabriel began, "I know you're carrying an enormous weight, but the truth is that your mother loves you so much that she was willing to sacrifice her own freedom for you. Now, we need to work together to correct this. We need to present this confession to the court in the right way, to minimize the damage." Lucas agreed, although fear still tormented him. He knew that confessing would be just the beginning of a new struggle, but for the first time, he felt he was doing the right thing. Gabriel and Sophia were by his side, and together they began to prepare the new strategy. Meanwhile, in prison, Isabel felt that something was changing. She didn't know what it was, but she felt a slight hope growing in her chest. Even on the darkest nights, when loneliness threatened to overwhelm her, she clung to the idea that Lucas, somewhere out there, was fighting for her. And that, more than anything else, kept her strong. In the days that followed his decision to confess the truth about the accident, Lucas felt as if he were beginning to free himself from the invisible chains that had imprisoned him since that fateful night. Guilt still weighed on his heart, but for the first time in a long time, he felt he was doing something right. The confession to lawyer Gabriel not only marked the beginning of his fight for justice for Isabel, but also the beginning of his own transformation. Lucas began to move away from the self-destructive habits that had consumed him since his mother was imprisoned. Alcohol, which he once used as a way to escape reality, was set aside. He knew he needed to be completely lucid to face what was to come. The nights he once spent in bars were now dedicated to reflection and planning. He wanted to be a man his mother could be proud of, someone who could carry the burden of his mistakes with dignity, and more importantly, someone capable of correcting what he had done. Clara, who had always been by Lucas's side, became a pillar in his life during this transformation. She saw how much he was struggling against his inner demons and did everything she could to support him. The long conversations they had at night, where Lucas finally opened up about his fears and regrets, helped him process the emotions he had repressed for so long. Clara encouraged him not to give up, constantly reminding him that he still had the chance to do things right, to redeem himself. Despite Clara's support, Lucas knew that the journey he was embarking on would be lonely in many aspects. He needed to confront not only the justice system that had condemned his mother, but also the darkest parts of himself. The pain of guilt was something he couldn't fully share with anyone, not even Clara. Each step he took towards redemption was accompanied by the ghost of the past, reminding him of what was at stake. Lucas decided that he couldn't just wait for things to resolve themselves. He needed to act. He began to get more actively involved in his mother's defense, working closely with Gabriel and Sophia. Each meeting with the lawyer was a mixture of fear and hope. They discussed strategies, reviewed evidence, and prepared testimonies, always aware that they were dealing with a system that wasn't always willing to correct its own mistakes. In addition to working on Isabel's defense, Lucas also decided that he needed to do something to help other people who were in similar situations. He volunteered at an organization that supported families of unjustly imprisoned people. There, he found a purpose that had been missing in his life for so long. Hearing other people's stories, feeling their pain and hope, gave Lucas a new perspective on his own struggle. He realized that he wasn't alone, that there were many other people fighting against the injustices of the system, and this inspired him to continue, even in the most difficult moments. Over time, Lucas began to gain the respect of those around him. The young man who was once seen as irresponsible and lost was now becoming a determined man, someone who was willing to fight for what he believed in. He got a stable job at a law firm, initially thanks to Gabriel's recommendation, but soon proved to be a valuable employee on his own merit. He immersed himself in work, learning everything he could about the legal system, determined to find any loophole that could help in his mother's case. Each day at the office was a new opportunity for Lucas to learn, to get a little closer to the goal of freeing Isabel. He read old cases, studied legal strategies, and constantly met with Gabriel to discuss new approaches. However, despite his professional growth, Lucas never lost sight of his main goal. Everything he did, all the knowledge he acquired, was directed towards the fight for his mother's justice. Clara, who saw Lucas's transformation up close, became increasingly impressed with the strength he was showing. They went through ups and downs in their relationship, but the adversities they faced together only brought them closer. Clara, who was studying psychology, used her knowledge to help Lucas deal with the emotional burden he carried. She knew that his journey was still far from over, but she was determined to be by his side every step of the way. Lucas also began to realize that his own suffering could be transformed into something positive. He used his pain as fuel to keep fighting, to keep growing. And as he advanced in his personal transformation, he also allowed himself to dream of the day when he could finally see his mother free. The letters he wrote to Isabel were a reflection of this new Lucas, a stronger, more mature man, but one who still carried in his heart the unconditional love for his mother. Each letter Isabel received was a mixture of joy and sadness. She was happy to see that Lucas was changing, that he was becoming the man she always knew he could be. But at the same time, the pain of being separated from him, of knowing that he was going through all of this because of a mistake she had agreed to take on, was almost unbearable. Still, Isabel never stopped believing in Lucas, and this faith was what kept her strong, even on the hardest days. Over time, Lucas's transformation became evident to everyone around him. He was no longer the young man who let himself be carried away by despair and insecurity. Now he was a determined man, someone who was willing to fight for his mother and for his own redemption. And as he continued this journey, one thing became clear to him. He wouldn't rest until his mother was free, until he could look into her eyes and know that he had done everything he could to correct the mistake that had almost destroyed their lives. As the months passed, Lucas realized that, despite all his effort and the dedication of Gabriel and Sophia, the judicial system seemed relentless in its refusal to reopen Isabel's case. Each appeal, each attempt to review the case was systematically rejected, and Lucas felt frustration growing inside him. He knew he needed something more, something that could attract public attention and put pressure on the system. And that's when he had an idea that could change the course of his fight: a public campaign. Lucas had seen other successful campaigns on social media, where people in desperate situations managed to mobilize public support and even influence legal decisions. He knew that his mother's story, a woman who had sacrificed her freedom for her son, had the power to resonate with people, to awaken empathy and support. He decided it was time to take the fight beyond the walls of the court and into the court of public opinion. With Clara's help, Lucas began to plan the campaign. They spent nights discussing strategies, sketching ideas, and preparing materials. Clara, who was talented with technology, created a website dedicated to Isabel's story. The site, titled Justice for Isabel, detailed the case from the beginning, telling how Isabel had been unjustly imprisoned and the sacrifice she had made to protect Lucas. There were photos of Isabel and Lucas in happier times, letters Lucas had written to his mother, and testimonials from people who supported the cause. Lucas also created profiles on various social media platforms to share the story and attract followers. He knew he needed a wide reach, so he used hashtags like #JusticeForIsabel and #FreedomForIsabel to generate attention and make it easier for people to find and share the campaign. He spent hours creating posts, sharing memories of his mother, and asking for support for the cause. Each post was a direct appeal to the public, asking them to sign an online petition that demanded a review of Isabel's case and her immediate release. In the first days after the campaign launch, support was modest. A few dozen people signed the petition, and some shared the story on social media. But Lucas knew he needed more. He needed Isabel's story to go viral, to resonate with as many people as possible. He began contacting journalists and bloggers, trying to attract media attention. He knew that a single news report could make all the difference. Gradually, the campaign began to gain traction. Local media began to take interest, and some journalists contacted Lucas for interviews. Friends and colleagues of Lucas, as well as members of the organization where he volunteered, began to share the campaign, extending it to their own circles. Soon, Isabel's story began to spread, and the number of signatures on the petition began to grow significantly. One night, Lucas received an email that accelerated his heart. It was from a prominent journalist from a national television network. They wanted to do a special report on Isabel's case, telling her story to a much larger audience. Lucas knew that this was the big opportunity he had been waiting for, the chance to take the campaign to the next level. "Clara, look at this!" exclaimed Lucas, showing the email to her with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "This is our big chance. If we can get this report to air, we can generate even greater support." Clara smiled and hugged him, feeling the renewed determination and hope in Lucas. "You're doing an amazing job, Lucas. I'm so proud of you. This is just the beginning." Lucas spent the following days preparing for the interview. He knew he needed to tell his mother's story in the most authentic and moving way possible. He wanted people to understand the sacrifice Isabel had made, how much she was suffering, and how much he needed their support to correct this injustice. When the day of the interview arrived, Lucas was nervous but determined. He knew this was a crucial opportunity to bring his mother's case to a wider audience. At the television studio, he was greeted by a production team that prepared him for the recording. The bright lights and cameras were intimidating, but Lucas kept his focus on his mission, to do justice for Isabel. The host of the program was a respected figure in journalism, known for his empathetic and incisive interviews. "Good evening, Lucas. Thank you for being here today," said the host with a warm smile, trying to put Lucas at ease. "Thank you for having me," replied Lucas, trying to maintain his composure as he prepared to tell his mother's story. "Tell us about your mother, Isabel Diaz, and why you believe she deserves to be freed," the host began, giving Lucas the opportunity to share his story. Lucas took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice clear and firm. "My mother, Isabel Diaz, was unjustly imprisoned 5 years ago for a crime she didn't commit. On that fateful night, she was just trying to protect me. She took the blame for an accident I caused, an accident that almost killed a man. My mother sacrificed herself for me, and she paid a very high price for something she didn't do. Now, with new evidence and testimonies, we are fighting for her freedom." The host nodded, showing empathy, and Lucas continued to tell his mother's story, talking about the sacrifice she had made, about the pain she was facing in prison, and about how he was determined to correct the mistake he had made. He asked the public to support the campaign, to sign the petition, and help pressure the judicial system to review Isabel's case. The interview was a success, and when it aired, it generated a significant impact. Isabel's story touched the hearts of many people, and the campaign began to gain strength quickly. The online petition soon began to gather thousands of signatures, and national media began to cover the case with more attention. Lucas felt that finally the tide was beginning to turn in his favor. But the journey was far from over. Each new support Lucas gained was a step in the right direction, but he knew there was still much work to be done. The fight for justice for Isabel was turning into a movement, and Lucas was determined to lead it to the end. He knew the path would be long and difficult, but now, more than ever, he believed he could win. After the initial success of the public campaign, Lucas felt he was finally gaining ground in the fight for his mother's freedom. However, the path was still uncertain, and the pressure of time and expectations began to weigh on his shoulders. Each new day brought a mixture of hope and despair, and Lucas knew he needed to stay focused to not succumb to the pressure. It was in this state of mind that he made a discovery that rekindled his determination and gave him the means to act more decisively. One night, exhausted after a long day of work and meetings, Lucas decided to organize some old boxes he had set aside. He needed a distraction, something to help take his mind off constant worries. As he rummaged through old papers and photos, he found a sealed envelope he had never seen before. The paper was yellowed with time, and the name Lucas was handwritten on the front. With trembling hands, he opened the envelope, feeling a mixture of curiosity and anxiety. Inside the envelope, Lucas found a letter written by his mother and several carefully folded $100 bills. As he counted the money, he realized there was more than $25,000 there. Lucas's heart raced, and he hurried to read the letter. In Isabel's words, there was a painful and loving explanation. "Dear Lucas, if you're reading this letter, it's probably because you've realized I saved this money for you. These are my savings, money I set aside with great effort to ensure you have a better future, to pay for your studies, and give you the chance to have the life I always dreamed for you. My dear son, I want you to know how much I love you and how much you mean to me. I've always believed in you and your ability to overcome any obstacle. Although things are difficult now, I know you'll find your way. This money is yours. Use it wisely and keep fighting for your dreams. With all my love, Mom." Tears began to roll down Lucas's face as he read the letter. His mother's sacrifice, which was already immense, now seemed even greater. This money, the fruit of years of work and saving, was tangible proof of the unconditional love Isabel had for him. She had set everything aside to ensure he had a future, even if it meant giving up her own needs. Sitting on the floor, surrounded by the bills and the letter, Lucas cried. He cried for the pain he had caused, for his mother's sacrifice, and for the responsibility that now fell on him. At dawn, after a sleepless night, Lucas made a decision. He wouldn't give up. He would use that money to help free his mother. Determined to act immediately, he sought out Gabriel and Sophia to discuss the best way to use Isabel's savings. After a long and careful conversation, they agreed that the best way to proceed would be to pay Isabel's bail while continuing to fight for her case appeal. The feeling of hope and nervousness mixed as Lucas, Gabriel, and Sophia went to court with the necessary documentation and money for the bail. They knew that getting Isabel's release didn't mean the end of the fight, but it was a crucial step. In court, the judge examined the documents and heard Gabriel's arguments. The moment seemed frozen for Lucas as they waited for the decision. Finally, the judge announced, "Mr. Diaz, this court accepts Isabel Diaz's bail. She will be released on bail of $24,000. The judge's words sounded like music to Lucas's ears. An enormous weight was lifted from his shoulders, and he could barely contain the tears of relief. When Isabel left prison, visibly thinner but with an expression of relief and joy, Lucas ran to her and hugged her tightly. "Mom, you're free," he said, his voice choked with emotion. Isabel, also with tears in her eyes, hugged him back, feeling the warmth and safety of her son's embrace for the first time in years. "I never doubted you, Lucas," said Isabel, her voice full of love and pride. "I knew you would do this. I knew you wouldn't give up." Lucas, still holding her, felt the weight of all the years of struggle and sacrifice begin to dissipate. "I had to pay for my mistakes, Mom, even if I wasn't in prison. My internal struggle was torturous, but now, with you here, I feel I can deal with it all better," Lucas confessed, feeling a mixture of relief and remorse. That night, they returned home and sat in the same living room where so many letters were read and so many tears were shed. They reflected on the long journey that brought them here, on Isabel's sacrifice, Lucas's transformation, and the love that kept them united throughout this time. That first night of freedom, although conditioned by bail, was a moment of profound relief for Isabel and Lucas. They knew that although the legal battle was still far from over, this was a significant step towards justice. The fact that Isabel was back in her home, even if temporarily, brought a sense of normalcy that both had lost long ago. That night, Lucas and Isabel stayed up late, talking in the living room as they used to do before all this happened. The painful memories of the past were present, but there was also renewed hope in the air. Isabel's physical presence at home, after so many years apart, brought up a flood of emotions that they couldn't contain. Lucas, sitting on the couch next to Isabel, held her hands and said, "Mom, I've never been so proud of you. I saw how much you suffered, how much you fought, and how strong you remained for me. You proved to be a brave and loving woman, and there's no greater reward for a son than to see his mother's strength." Isabel looked at her son, her eyes full of tears, but also of deep peace. "Lucas, everything I am, everything I did was for you. When I accepted that guilt, I knew I was risking everything, but I did it because I believe in you. I believed that you would find a way to redeem yourself and, more importantly, to find your path. And seeing the man you've become, there's no greater joy for me." Despite the happiness of being together again, the reality of the situation soon imposed itself. Isabel still faced a prison sentence, and the legal process had not yet been concluded. But instead of succumbing to despair, Isabel and Lucas decided that they would make the most of this time together. They knew that every moment was precious, and both were determined to do whatever was necessary to continue fighting for her definitive freedom. In the days that followed, Lucas met again with Gabriel and Sophia to discuss the next steps. The bail money had given Isabel temporary freedom, but everyone knew it was crucial to continue working to overturn the sentence. Gabriel was exploring new legal strategies, and Sophia, always optimistic, was using her contacts to mobilize more support for the public campaign. Lucas, in turn, was more determined than ever. He knew there was still much to be done, but Isabel's freedom, even if partial, rekindled his determination to fight to the end. He began to spend more time with Gabriel, learning about the appeal process and reviewing every detail of the case. Lucas knew he couldn't leave anything to chance. Every piece of evidence, every testimony, every legal document was a crucial piece in the fight for his mother's total freedom. Meanwhile, Isabel, even under the shadow of uncertainty, began to resume some aspects of her previous life. She visited old friends, met with neighbors who had supported her during her imprisonment, and spent time taking care of the house she hadn't seen for so long. For Isabel, each small act of normalcy was a victory, a way to reaffirm her identity and her life outside the prison walls. Lucas also found solace in rebuilding the life they had both lost. He and Clara began to make plans for the future, a future where Isabel would be free, and they could finally leave behind the nightmare that had consumed them for so long. Clara, who had been a pillar of support for Lucas during his transformation, continued to be by his side, helping him balance the tireless work of fighting for Isabel's case with the need to take care of himself. Despite the difficulties, Lucas and Isabel allowed themselves to dream of the future. They knew that the road ahead was still full of challenges, but for the first time in a long time, there was light at the end of the tunnel. Isabel's freedom on bail was not just temporary relief. It was a symbol of the renewed hope that both needed to continue. 5 years had passed since that fateful night, and although time had taken its toll, it also brought profound transformations for Lucas and Isabel. The fight for justice was not just a battle against the legal system, but a journey of self-discovery, growth, and redemption. What began as a desperate effort to free Isabel turned into something much bigger, a story of love, sacrifice, and the unbreakable strength of family bonds. Lucas, who once saw himself sinking into guilt and despair, was now a completely different man. He had found a purpose in his life, a goal that transcended the simple act of trying to correct a mistake. In fighting for his mother's freedom, he was also fighting to become the person she always believed he could be. The lost young man who once sought solace at the bottom of a bottle was now a lawyer in training, determined to use his skills and knowledge to help not only his mother, but also other unjustly imprisoned people. The work Lucas did as a volunteer in an organization that supported families of unjustly convicted people gave him a new perspective on life. He saw the suffering of others, the pain that injustice could cause, and this only motivated him more to continue his fight. Each story he heard, each person he met, reinforced his conviction that justice, although often elusive, was something worth fighting for. Clara, who had been by Lucas's side every step of this journey, became an essential part of his life and his struggle. Their relationship, tested by difficulties and challenges, became stronger and deeper. Clara, with her background in psychology, helped Lucas navigate the turbulent emotional waters he faced. She also got involved in the public campaign, using her skills to help shape the message and reach more people. Isabel, in turn, was deeply proud of the man her son had become. During those years in prison, she clung to the hope that one day she would see Lucas redeem himself. And now, living this reality, she felt a mixture of relief and gratitude. Despite the difficulties they faced, she knew that the love and faith she had nurtured for her son throughout her life had been rewarded. Sundays, which were once visiting days full of sadness and goodbyes, were now days of family reunion. Lucas and Isabel spent hours together, talking about the past, present, and future. They talked about the dreams they had for the future, about how they wanted to use the experience they had lived to help other people. Isabel, who had become a maternal figure for so many women in prison, wanted to continue helping other women in difficult situations. And Lucas, inspired by his mother's strength, was determined to continue fighting for justice not just for her, but for everyone who needed it. Gabriel and Sophia's work also continued, and each day brought new developments in Isabel's case. They were exploring all possible legal options, determined to find a way to overturn Isabel's sentence. And although the path was difficult, everyone was united by the hope that soon, Isabel would be completely exonerated. One day, while walking through the park where he used to go with his mother as a child, Lucas sat on a bench and took a notebook from his pocket. Writing had become a ritual for him, a way to process his emotions and maintain his connection with Isabel. He wrote about his dreams, his hopes, and about how his mother's sacrifice had shaped him. Writing was a way to keep alive the promise he had made to himself and his mother, the promise to never give up. The letters Lucas wrote were a mixture of love, regret, and determination. Although he knew there was still much to be done, he felt that each word written brought him a little closer to his redemption and his mother's release. For Lucas, writing was not just a means of communication. It was a way to keep fighting, to transform pain into hope, and to keep the flame of justice alive. The sun was setting when Lucas finished writing his latest letter. He put away the notebook and looked at the horizon, feeling an inner peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. He knew the journey was still far from over, but he also knew that, with the support of his mother, Clara, Gabriel, Sophia, and all those who had joined them, he had the strength necessary to keep fighting. Isabel's case continued to gain public attention, and the campaign Lucas had started was turning into a national movement. The number of signatures on the petition continued to grow, and politicians and public figures began to position themselves in support of Isabel's release. The fight for justice, which once seemed an isolated battle, was now a cause shared by many. Lucas knew that each step forward was a victory, not just for his mother, but for all who believed that justice should prevail. He also knew that, no matter what the future held, he would never be alone in this fight. His mother's love and strength, Clara's unconditional support, and Gabriel and Sophia's dedication were the foundations on which he would build the future. And so, with the sun disappearing on the horizon and the promise of a new day approaching, Lucas got up from the bench in the park and began to walk back home. He knew that the journey would still be long and full of challenges, but he also knew that, for the first time in many years, he was on the right path. The fight for justice for Isabel was far from over, but Lucas was more determined than ever to see his mother free and to continue fighting for what he believed in. And with each step he took, he got a little closer to fulfilling that promise.